朋友们，你是否也曾有过这样的疑问？当一个生活在西方的老外带着脑海里所有被 CNN、BBC 灌输的中国恐怖故事，真正踏上中国的土地时，他的大脑会经历怎样的宕机？这是一位前加拿大记者，他不是普通的游客，他曾深谙西方媒体的运作逻辑。在搬到中国前，他以为中国的雾霾厚到伸手不见五指，甚至以为中国的太阳都是红色的。但是当他真的来到中国，他震惊了。干净的街道，安全的夜晚，蓝色的天空，还有多伦多修了20年都没修好的地铁，北京和天津居然在极短的时间内建了10几条。他不仅疯狂吐槽了西方的拉胯基建和被房地产资本裹挟的城市规划，更是以一个内行人的身份，硬核扒下了西方媒体长期炒作的中国债务陷阱的画皮。他一针见血地指出，到底是谁在用结构调整逼迫非洲国家变卖医院，又是谁在金融殖民？这绝不是一次普通的跨国体验分享，这是一场对西方政治虚伪和媒体双标的贴脸开大。准备好颠覆你的认知了吗？准备好看看西方精英面对真实的中国是如何破防的吗？废话不多说，让我们大家一起来看正片。
We see a lot of Westerners travel to studying in China, move to China, and they have a lot of cultural shock. Some are very critical of China because things are run in different ways. But some of them just very...
Listen, I'll say one thing when I got here.
Yeah.
I don't know how you people survive traffic. Traffic, listen, if traffic intersections were run in the West that they are here, there would be mass death events every day. I don't know how people with people just like e-bikes and taxis just weaving in and out of traffic, and traffic lights sometimes being more suggestions than actual hard-coded rules. That's something I don't think I'll ever get used to. But it's just, yeah, sure, it's different over here. Things are going to be different.
Yeah. How do you feel the cultural differences? So I can maybe give you some examples. For example, I was very shocked that a lot of my friends from the United States or UK or Canada, very developed Western countries, when the first time they come to Beijing or other cities in China, I ask them, how do you feel? What do you like about the city? They always say, oh, it's so clean. Yeah. Or, oh, the air is so good, or the sky is so blue. I mean, such simple stuff that I would think you would say, oh, the food is incredible, the way you cook it, or they design this building in such a majestic way, but they're clean, safe, you can walk alone at night, and the sky is blue. On those simple things that every city
you have to understand, okay, to some extent, there's a couple of dynamics at play here, right? Mm. When you read a newspaper in the West, and this is true of me, and I would say it's probably true of a lot of people, you open up a newspaper and you read about China, and you're just reading horror stories. You're reading about like some company manufacturing fake baby formula that kills people. You're reading about counterfeit food. And you think it's happening because people simply don't have the money to buy food to eat here. You read stories about the smog in Beijing being so thick that you can't see your hand in front of your face. So when you're inculcated with these stories about China and then not seeing any stories about China's development, but you're just seeing nothing but horror stories wall to wall, right up until around 2022. I think it started to alleviate around 2008, but there was still almost like a single narrative of bad stories. But right around 2022, 2023, then you start seeing some positive stories, and you're like, okay, who's lying here? So when people get here and see China for themselves, they're like, wow, you guys have running water in your apartments? You have indoor plumbing? You have electricity? What? You don't use you don't burn dung for fuel? You have blue skies? I thought the sun in China was red because of the smog that exists everywhere. Not knowing that there have been steps, obviously, to clean up the environment, to develop infrastructure at a very rapid pace. I would say at a pace that embarrasses Western countries, frankly. You're not really privy to that until you start scrolling social media at a certain time. And I think for some people, it's like their minds go one of two ways. Either A, okay, maybe I haven't been told the full story. There's things I don't know. Or B, which is, I would say like a very Western approach, is this must be lies. It's fake. Fake news. Fake news, folks. It's AI. It's not real. China's very bad, folks. Very bad. Terrible country. Loser country. That's what they think. Yeah. Right? So when they actually get here, it's like, this is completely at odds with everything that I understood before.
So and now a lot of people start to hype China's development success, saying China is way advanced than Western countries, where development is like. So there are different voices. How do you feel? How do you feel like China's development, the governance, coming from with a Western perspective?
I see stories of like politicians that came from smaller tier cities, like tier 3 cities and so on, and like rural areas, and they'll hold like celebrations for some politician. And I'm just like, why do they love this person so much? And it's because that person was able to bring like infrastructure and development to areas that simply never had it before. Now, when you live in a city like Toronto, and keep in mind, I love my hometown, but like, our high water mark was in the mid 2000s, like right around like 2010 to 2014-ish was our high water mark. And then you began to see a gradual decline, which after COVID became a very rapid decline. So at the very same time that like governments are putting fewer dollars into infrastructure because they see it as waste, they're putting fewer dollars into public services, everything is being rapidly privatized. Looking over here and seeing, I get on the high-speed rail and I'm just like, I wish we had this in Canada. Like we've wanted a high-speed rail corridor from Toronto. Like we want a high-speed rail corridor that basically runs from Windsor, Ontario through Toronto into Quebec. This is where I would say I wouldn't say the majority, but a significant almost plurality of Canadians lives along that corridor. We've wanted this for decades. And it can't happen because infrastructure development follows the lead of real estate companies. So at the very same time, we're seeing stories that this company, Evergrande, is going to collapse the Chinese economy. We think of it as like a Chinese Lehman Brothers or Bear Stearns. We think that a single company, which created an asset bubble, its collapse is going to take the entire Chinese economy down with it. And then that just doesn't happen. And then we hear the stories about these ghost cities, and we're laughing about it in the 2010s. And then by the time I get here, I'm like, oh, those cities are all populated. Wait a second. So are you telling me that government can proactively take measures to develop infrastructure for where people are going to be? They can actually plan like the development of cities rather than concentrating people into the smallest possible area simply because real estate developers want to build there because they're chasing profit? How is this even possible? There was a transit line that opened up. So for 20 odd years now, Toronto, in partnership with the government of Toronto's the capital of Ontario, Canada, and Toronto's also the largest city in Canada. Toronto, the city, in partnership with the province of Ontario, has been trying to create a rail line along the middle of the city, along Midtown, for about 20 years. And the line just opened up this year. So we have 3 functional rail lines in the city. In Beijing, I live on line 17.
I've never taken line 17.
Yeah, but when I take line 17 home from work, it's filled with people. And the same neighborhood that I'm living in right now, you could have called 20 years ago, you could have called that like a ghost town. A ghost suburb, right? So like the idea that governments plan infrastructure on a central, like they centrally manage the development of infrastructure and it actually works is mind-boggling, because in the West, generally, infrastructure development follows the building of real estate. So wherever people end up moving because a real estate development company thinks they're going to make money, that's where the people are. Now, in Ontario, at least, people are being sprawled out to these far-flung areas. You have people traveling from like Orangeville, Ontario. If you want to go look up Orangeville in your free time, you go ahead. But they're traveling from so far, basically like a fairly large suburb outside of Toronto, Ontario is Hamilton. Hamilton was just another city. Like, it's not an area that you would think people commute to work on a regular, or commute from to go to work on a regular basis. And yet, Toronto is now so unaffordable that people are commuting in, they're buying property in Hamilton and commuting in from Hamilton, which is driving up Hamilton real estate prices. So the people in Hamilton are having a hard time managing their property taxes, because since so many people are moving there because the housing was cheap at one time, driving up prices, driving up not only property taxes, but utilities, etc. So the people who live there have a hard time living now because nothing is centrally planned. Everything chases profits. This is like, on a regular basis, commuting from Tianjin into Beijing because you cannot afford anything here. Do people do that? Yes. But the majority of people who live in Tianjin also work there. This is not the way that it functions in Toronto. It's so sprawled from these far-flung areas, but the transit infrastructure to support people living so far out from the center of the city doesn't exist yet. So when I see that this one line took 20 years to develop, and at the very same time, Beijing has developed probably like 24, or sorry, 12 rail lines at the same time. And in Tianjin, they have, I forget how many rail lines they have over there. I think it's like 12 at this point. That's like Hamilton, Ontario having 12 rail lines. Hamilton, Ontario doesn't have a single rail line, not one. It doesn't exist in the city. So that was the biggest shock to me as somebody who is interested, at least nominally, in urban development, because that determines the way people live. It determines their quality of life. And having a decent quality of life, I think, is essential to forming a satisfied body politic, people that actually enjoy getting up and going to work on a day-to-day basis. If you can't provide for those basic needs, you're going to have unrest, disassociation in your society. And I think what actually works here is that there is a plan for how to develop cities, how to develop transit, how to connect people from one area of the country to another area of the country so that people can actually visit and view their entire country. There are people that I know in Toronto that have never been to Western Canada and vice versa. They simply can't afford to do that. And I think that is putting aside any sort of cultural differences, putting aside any political or ideological differences, I think that is the biggest difference that Western governments can learn from, is actually planning infrastructure and economies that work for people and not letting profit chasers and rent seekers do that for them.
So you mentioned like earlier, a lot of foreigners who first time came to China with all the image they've been told by media, the very negative images, negative information about China, and they came here, they're very shocked with everything they saw. So how, if you have tell like the people who first time come to China how to understand China or how to comprehend the information they see, what advice would you give them?
I think anybody who comes from an immigrant family, at least if they're like second generation or third generation because their parents or grandparents moved into a Western country, I think it would be a lot easier for them to understand China in a way, because Chinese people kind of generally remind me of like the way that my family or my grandparents and my parents are, in the sense that like it's a very like an old school mentality in terms of like the way that people relate to each other in society. Basic things like saying hello to your neighbor, just the general like the basic politeness that you would have in the city or province of your parents' birth.
Comments about China are very different from the Western people.
Yeah.
So Western people don't like many things in China, like the cameras, they say the surveillance
everywhere. Yeah.
Or they don't like that's done in that way. But global South people, I encounter, they always have a how to say, positive comments.
I would say
China.
if you airdrop the Jamaican person in here, they would get along just fine. Like for example, like I would
we don't dance too much. A lot of Chinese people don't dance too much.
This is where you all need some help. This is where you need some help, all right? Yeah. No, we could actually show you. We could show you like like Caribbean dance. Okay, listen. If you guys can bring the ease of payment services like Weixin and Alipay, if you could bring that over to Jamaica, listen, we'll bring reggae and soca music over here. How about?
We do need more of that because. Maybe only the Han Chinese are not really good at the very.
I've seen some Han Chinese people at salsa lessons here. I have seen that.
Well, I'm one of them actually.
Okay. Right, okay.
Yeah. So you know what? That's the thing. I remember when I go to the United States, when I did Vox Pop, just talking to everybody on the streets. Most people they don't know anything about China, or they cannot give concrete comment on China, or they maybe want to run away when they hear I'm a journalist from China. I know they have some very negative comments about us.
Yeah.
So they either run away from us or they don't know anything about China. But the only people that give me I think it's really good answer from a journalist perspective are the immigrants. I remember a Mexican guy because he said, even though I've never been to China, I don't know much about China, but I know don't judge a country, a culture just by what the media has been telling you. I was like, wow, finally, like a reasonable
Because look
answer.
at what Western media says about Mexico.
Yes.
You listen to CNN or CBC even, you listen to like these Western media outfits talk about a place like Mexico, and you think that it's an absolute hellhole. You think that like you step 1 foot over the border and you're going to be kidnapped by like a coyote or a member of MS-13. Like this is the single narrative that's being told about. It's the very same thing in Jamaica, where like people have either one of two opinions about Jamaica. It's like it's a bacchanal. It's basically just like a Western playground. You go there, you smoke marijuana, and you like, you strip down to your underwear and like dance on the beach. They think it's either that or like it's a narco trafficking country. It's like a third world country that is ruled by drug kingpins. That's the story that is told about our countries. So I think knowing that this is the way that Western media talks about the countries where either we come from or our parents come from, there's an innate knowledge that we're not hearing the truth necessarily about China. And the other part is that if you actually get here as somebody who is either from or very familiar with developing countries, it's like, wow, this is what, with independence, with like actual sovereignty, economic sovereignty, if we could actually like make our countries work without Western interference, it could actually look like this. And I think that's why people from those countries have a greater appreciation.
And also maybe that's one of the reasons why some Western politicians are so afraid of China's rise.
Absolutely.
Because you are giving global South countries an idea, an inspiration that you can have, when you have sovereignty, you can be like this.
Which is why there is this narrative that's happening that China is basically like plunging Africa into a debt trap. Not just Africa, but the Caribbean, South America, pretty much where like China wants to rule the world. If you listen to like the Joe Rogan show, for example, there's this idea that China wants to rule the world, but you don't even have to go that far. You can be listening to mainstream media or reading newspapers and so on, and you hear everything about this debt trap diplomacy, which is a narrative that started around 2017, I believe. There's a back and forth over this article that was written by Deborah Brodigan, and it was about what China is doing in Africa. And so if you listen to Western media, there's basically like a trade of colonization. Western countries are now out and China is now in. They've basically traded colonists. That one's really difficult for me to talk about because you never want to, on the one hand, like erase any actual damage that's being done. Like you don't want to speak over people that have had negative experiences, but being able to parse this information and hash out these details to explain what's actually happening is very difficult, especially when you're in social media or even in Western media. There's articles that I've pitched about this very topic that have been rejected, where I want to talk about like, okay, so here's what happened in this mine in Zimbabwe, or here's what's been happening in Zambia. This is what actually happened with regards to Entebbe Airport in Uganda. This is what actually happened with regards to the port in Mombasa, etc. Like, you try to talk about these things to like parse out what Western news tells us from what actually happened. Sure, it's not a great story. It doesn't necessarily look 100% good on China, but there's also like 90% of it was an actual lie. For example, like the idea about China seizing ports and airports in Africa. You look at the actual contracts or the stories that's being built around these contracts, and you realize that there has never actually been a debt management contract between China and any African country or entity that puts up infrastructure as collateral. So, for example, the idea that China is going to like seize a port, like a shipping port, or seize an airport, well, it doesn't exist because they were never put up for collateral in the first place. Cash is put up as collateral, not the actual infrastructure. I think there was one issue where there was an airport. It was the Kenyan Port Authority. This is what I'm remembering now. It was the Kenyan Port Authority had created a contract with not just the Chinese, not just with the Exim Bank, not just with China Exim Bank, but also Chinese lenders. I think the port itself ended up being listed as the borrower, but that wasn't actually the case. It was the Port Authority that was the borrower, not the port itself. So when you actually read the contract, you realize, okay, there's a mistake in the contract, but neither of the parties ever agreed to have the port be put up for collateral so that in the event that the debt couldn't be serviced, the port is seized. Never happened. At the very same time, it's like, well, yeah, but in any debtor-lender relationship, it's going to be uneven. Like the debtor is going to, in many ways, have leverage exercised over them. The difference is, when you look at China's lending contracts with African countries, this isn't just, Kenya or Uganda, Zimbabwe, Zambia, etc. This is pretty much any country. You don't see a condition of structural adjustments. And I mean, you're pretty familiar with structural adjustments, but maybe your audience necessarily isn't. Structural adjustments basically means that your social services now have to be privatized in order to qualify for this loan, or as a condition of not being able to service this loan at some point in the future. So for example, like if interest rates go up or inflation goes up or something, and you have trouble managing this debt, well, what that triggers as a consequence is now you have to sell your hospitals into private hands, right? And that is very much the case where it comes to IMF loans within African countries. There's always the structural adjustment clause that's included within it. But beyond that, because it's not always just one entity, it's not always just the IMF, there's also private lenders that are involved as well. And when some of those lenders are not able to collect on the loans, because there's lenders of first, the people who are entitled to their money first, people who are entitled to their money second, depending on how the contracts are written. When those secondary lenders are having trouble collecting on their debts, because again, during COVID, many African countries had trouble servicing their debts or interest rates had gone up and so on. Those lenders then sold the debt off to a collector who would then file a lawsuit to collect the debt by whatever means possible. So what this means is a country like Zambia, for example, if they receive debt relief or some sort of additional loan to make it easier on them to, let's say, build or expand hospitals to help with this COVID crisis, then some private capital entity can file a lawsuit in the UK to seize the money that was intended for the health and benefit of Zambian people, like life-saving services for Zambian people, and they say, no, that money belongs to us. So a $3.3 million purchase on this distressed debt and a $55 million lawsuit against the Zambian government means you can just seize $15 million. You put in $3.3 million, you get back $15 million that was intended for the people. This is what happens when Western countries engender debts in African countries. To my knowledge, I could be wrong, and someone can try and prove me wrong on this. To my knowledge, that has never happened. There has never been any means of structural adjustment that is written into these contracts with African countries from China. Now, at the very same time, there have been problems with, say, mining companies, managers of mining companies that have, committed abuses against African laborers and so on. That is 100% true. It has happened. But the way that Western media paints it as if African countries are children, South American countries are children that are not capable of understanding the terms of their loans and can't advocate for themselves. And therefore, any sort of financial dealings that they have with China must necessarily be exploitative. It's basically them telling on themselves. It's like, well, we exploit them, so therefore, if they sign a deal with another country that's not us, they must be exploiting them instead. Listen, Africans, you want to have the devil you know versus the devil you don't, and that's where these stories come from.
Yeah. I've interviewed many African politicians and scholars in my previous shows. People can check those videos. They said the same thing. They said, well, the Western government's been telling us, oh, be careful with China. China is colonizing you.
Yeah.
And I was like, we know what colonialism looks like and feels like.
Yeah.
We know it very well because we live under your colonialism for so many years.
At the very same time.
Yeah.
At the very same time, the French Prime Minister is funding terrorist organizations to try and recapture the Sahel region, and is then going to go on a lecture tour to African countries about borrowing from China. How does it not compute that what you're doing is actually it's functionally and morally worse?
看完这段访谈，不知道大家是什么感觉？从对中国充满误解，到被中国基建深深折服；从嘲笑鬼城，到惊叹于中国政府前瞻性的城市规划。这位嘉宾的转变，其实是无数个真实来到中国的老外的缩影。更让人细思极恐的是他最后提到的那一点：西方政客为什么那么害怕中国的崛起？不是因为什么所谓的统治世界，而是因为中国给广大的全球南方国家提供了一个活生生的例子。一个国家在不被西方干涉，拥有绝对主权的情况下，到底可以发展得多好？这才是西方霸权真正害怕的大杀器。那么，屏幕前的你又是怎么看的呢？你觉得西方媒体对中国的阴间滤镜还能维持多久？你在海外遇到过对中国抱有这种根深蒂固偏见的人吗？欢迎在评论区留下你的看法，跟我一起讨论。别忘了点赞、订阅并开启小铃铛，这样你就不会错过我们下一期更硬核的深度解析啦。我们下期见，拜拜。